So, thank you, and welcome to this particular class. I am Alasdair Mac Roibeirt. I'm in the Barony of Glenmere and the Kingdom of Ontir. This is the fifth class that I've done in an ongoing series, kind of an intro to woodworking and intro to recreation woodworking specifically. The main premise behind this is a lot of people look at things and they decide it's too much work. I can never do that, or they want to get into woodworking but they're not really sure how, and they go out and they spend a lot of money on tools and things that they might not necessarily need. So this class and this series is kind of aimed at people who are going in and starting with little or no knowledge, and focusing on projects and the tools you'll need to do that project, with each class actually providing information and foundation for the next class. So far, the first class was on the 6 board box, and we talked about saws. The second class was on a 15th century breakdown box, or breakdown bench, excuse me, and we discussed chisels and how to use those. Um, Following that, we did a finishes, hinges, and hardware class and discussed some of those options. The most recent previously one was the Goxted bed, and we kind of reinforced what we had already learned about chisels. We focused more on mortise and tenon joints. On this particular class, we're going to be talking about trestle tables and hand planes. One thing that has been brought up previously that I have not really gone in depth on, that I want to take a moment to go into now, is PPE, personal protective equipment. If you watch what I'm doing, a lot of times I'm not wearing a whole lot of it, and I really should be. Over the years, I have found that I have developed a pretty strong sensitivity to dust, sawdust especially. So to counteract that, I do tend to wear a mask when I'm not on camera, and I don't have to worry about being heard. I actually wear a fairly robust mask with replaceable filters. It's actually got a face protection as well, so that I don't have to wear safety glasses in addition to wearing the mask. I usually wear a set of headphones, these are here actually, that are noise canceling. Also, in this particular case, they're Bluetooth, so I can listen to music while I'm working in the shop. I have got a fairly severe hearing loss over the years and various things. So I gotta say, protect your senses. This is it's a fun hobby, but it can be dangerous to your health if you're not taking a little bit of precautions. So those are just some various basic ones. Any classes that you look at online, usually you'll see people talking about it. Wear safety glasses, wear a face shield, wear a dust mask or a respirator. Um, Dust collection systems are great, but most people, it's not something a lot of people really have. And for most hobbyists, going to that much effort is not really worthwhile. But you can pick up the simple masks, a little more difficult in these times now with them selling out, but just something to keep some of the dust out of your lungs is definitely worthwhile. So for this particular class, we're looking at doing trestle tables. We're going to look at the three-legged sawhorse style trestle tables, which we'll get into a bit more. Ultimately, you're going to need your lumber. You will need a saw of some sort. You're going to need some chisels, your mallet, a pencil or marking knife, and tape measure or measuring devices. If you've got them, a bevel gauge, which we've talked about in the past, is really handy. And of course, planes for doing your finishing work. So first off, what is a plane? A plane is nothing more than a wide chisel set into a holding mechanism to keep it at a steady distance. And as opposed to a chisel, which is used to dig into the wood usually, the plane is used to treat the surface. I've got a variety of them here we'll go into. Usually you can look at it, there are four main classifications for planes. The most common that everyone is really familiar with when they think of a plane is something like this. This is a metal bodied plane. It's got a handle in the back. It's got a knob in the front. It's got all kinds of levers and dials. And this is the workhorse. It's more of a modern, but it's what everyone's used to and usually what comes to mind. If you look in a lot of medieval manuscripts, you'll see wood bodied planes, which is a little bit more like this one here. Usually it doesn't have anything in the front. Sometimes it doesn't have the handle. A lot of times you'll just see them, they're a shaped up block and they're used by hands and you're just pushing along. This one is a little bit different. You're going in line with it and you're pushing as you go. You've also got your transition plane, which is, as it sounds, right in the middle of both. It's a wooden body, and then it has metal hardware on the top. It has the benefit of having the adjustable wheel here to control the depth of your cut, as well as a lever here that goes back and forth to control the angle of your cut. Um, then you've got specialty planes. There's quite a few of them here. You've got planes that are designed to cut rabbets in the edge of your lumber. So if you're doing a shelf or something, you want it to set in, or you need to cut a groove. You've got not really a specialty, but you've got low angle block planes, which are more for end grain of wood. They don't tear out as bad. You've got things like my favorite little one here, my little trim plane, just to take that little bit off. Um, this one, not too many people are as familiar with. This is a router plane. And unlike the router most modern workers are familiar with, which takes a bit that goes in and it cuts by circular motion as you're going on, this one is actually used for flattening holes and things. And you place it in there, you control your depth, and you move it as you're going to flatten the bottom of the hole. So it's not for profiling so much as a modern plane does. And then you've got like this guy here, and this is actually called a scraper plane. And this is for final finishing. It takes just a very small amount of material off, and it's good to get a nice smooth finish. It takes off a lot of your tool marks or your pencil marks or things like that. You don't find these a whole lot. They're out there, but you got to hunt for them a little bit more. Most of these you can find in garage sales. You can find in secondhand stores on occasion. You can find in antique stores. In fact, nothing here, barring this guy. I have not bought any of these new. I've bought them all secondhand from various sources. If you're going to do that, there's a lot of good information on there on things to look out for. You probably can't quite see in the detail, but this one here, if you'll notice, is not quite flat and square. It's actually a little bit off. So this one needs some work if I was going to actually put it back into use. And the iron on it is really thin. So it's not going to last quite as long. This one here it's pretty much a wall hanger. It is, if you look at it here, you can see it's been replaced. A piece put in here. There's some good cracks in there. Sometimes they're still usable. I have used this one on occasion, but it's getting rough and it's starting to come apart on me. So that's something that I'm going to have to look out for in the future. So I'm not going to go too much into a great deal of discussion on the planes. There's a lot of really good information out there. Just as a general idea, usually when you're buying a plane or you're getting a plane, you've got the blade, which is in here. Usually your bevel to the blade, if you can see this, is down, and it has what's called a chip breaker on top. And the chip breaker is, you want to get that flat and fairly close to the edge, usually within about a 16th of the edge. It helps to deflect your chips up. It keeps it helps minimize tear out, and it also helps to uh, keep from getting clogged as much. The mouth on which is the opening here on the plane. If you don't, you can get a lot of the curls will tend to wrap around there and get kind of gum up the works a bit. They don't let it travel as much. And then when you put it back together, a lot of times that blade will be in there a little skewed. So if you're going and you're taking cuts with it, you'll see that one side is kind of digging down and the other side is up a little bit higher. And that's where this little lever right here on the back comes in. You twist this sideways back and forth, and that will change the skew of your blade. That'll make it, you can get it flattened out, or if you need to, you can take it a little bit more, one side or the other. And then this little wheel here is what you use to advance or retract the blade to take a thinner cut or a deeper cut. That's it in a nutshell. A lot of that is going to come down to experience and playing around with it. If you're having a lot of troubles with getting a good, consistent, smooth finish using your plane, there's a lot of things to check. First and foremost, is your blade sharp? And you want it really sharp and smooth. You want it to take a nice, even cut. Sometimes if you just flip the board around, and you'll get a better cut. If you're not going against a grain, it will shear off on the top. Or take a thinner cut. Sometimes you're just trying to take a little bit too much. The sound of a nicely tuned plane and the ease that it will slice through the wood and the finish that it leaves is kind of a magical quality. And once you get used to it and once you get it dialed in, it's hard to go back. And going back to a sanded finish afterwards is kind of a letdown in some ways. The finish just isn't quite as nice. When you get to these older planes, these wooden bodied planes, they don't have all those fancy levers and adjustment. This is a lot more of a, you got to be in tune with your plane. When you get them, a lot of times, if you look at them, these older ones, you'll find that they've got a number of dimples and dents in the front and back. And the reason for that is to adjust these don't have the chip breaker usually. More often than not, these will be, the bevel will be opposite, so that the this one is really swollen on me because of the weather lately, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that out. There we go. So this one's been refit. It actually does have a chip breaker on it. But as I showed you with the steel-bodied plane, if you look at the steel-bodied plane, you'll notice that the bevel faces down, like so. Whereas with the wood-bodied plane, it's actually still going the same way um, because it's got the chip breaker. However, often if you don't have that chip breaker, it'll be flipped. So you'll have it going the other direction. And the angle that the the opening is cut in the wood-bodied plane will often determine which way it's supposed to go. Some of them, they will go bevel up, some will go bevel down, and that's really just kind of a matter of playing with it to figure out which way cuts better for you. So in this particular case, it's held in by a wood wedge. Sometimes there will be a steel bar going through it, and then the wedge will go in there, but this one is just an actual cut out in here, so this wedge will go in place and hold it in place. Now you can see this is really sticking out far. So I'm going to pull it back some. I'm going to pull it back some. To adjust these, you're going to just barely tap your wedge in, and then you're tapping the front and back of the plane to adjust your cut up and down. So usually, if I want my blade to go out to take a deeper cut, I'll tap it from the back, and that will lower the plane out and it'll take a deeper cut. You can see now, I've tapped it a few times, you can see that blade is really sticking out there. Now, if I'm taking too much of a cut, I'll go from the front, and that will usually retract the blade up. This one is not cooperating with me right now. And then you just seat your wedge in there, you're good to go. And again, as you're playing with it, you might find you might take a little bit more to one side, you might take a little bit more to the other side, and that's just going to be a matter of you're going to have to tap your blade by hand a little bit and adjust it instead of using that nice lever. These are really nice. They do require a bit of a difference though. Wood-bodied planes are meant to work with a shorter bench. There's a really good book out called The Ingenious Mechanics. It's put out by Lost Art Press, and if you're new to woodworking, it's a really good company for a lot of books to find. If you've been around a while, you might have encountered it already. The nice thing with that one is the Roman and I believe German benches that they found are a lot shorter. They're more of a bench instead of a tabletop like we're used to working now. And part of that is because of the weight of it. With these wood-bodied planes, they're a lot lighter. So the angle that you need to get a good shaving off them and to get a good curl, if you want to be, you get better results from being lower down than you do with these metal-bodied planes. These metal-bodied planes, the way you hold them is a lot different. You can see I want to be right here. So down here just doesn't really work for me. Whereas with this one, I'm here, I've got my weight behind it as I'm going. So it tends to, it's a lot different of a bench height, what works best for that particular plane. For this one, I'm a lot higher. It is designed for this style of bench here where it's up higher about waist height and I'm going back and forth with my material clamped down to my bench. Okay, I think we've gone through a good bit of that. One of the things you want to be real careful if you do end up trying your hand at using these wooden planes. You generally don't want to use like a standard, like a ball peen hammer or your claw hammer in there. You want a smaller hammer. You don't want a lot of impact. You don't want to put a lot of force in here to dent it. play with it a bit, work it loose, use a smaller hammer to get that slight bit of adjustment, and go from there. Otherwise, you put great big dents in the thing, and it just really can mess up your plane. Um, okay, so we talked about, I said there's a couple of different types of trestle tables. And the one that we're specifically going for is not this one here. So this is a pedestal style trestle. These are usually you find them like they're farmhouse tables or things like that. And if I can get this thing to actually come up. It is usually characterized, it's a solid one piece kind of setup. It is pillar or a decorative cut. Excuse me.
So we're not seeing the actual picture. We're just seeing your folder.
Okay, it's not showing just yet. Why is it not showing? There we go. Now you seeing it?
Not yet.
Okay. Is it not?
You may need to unshare and then reshare the actual there. Yeah.
There we go. How about now?
I'll let you know. There's always a delay. You see it before we do. There it is. Yes.
Okay. Technology, folks, gotta love it. So this is more of a pedestal style here, and this tends to be a solid piece. They don't generally come apart the same way, although you can make them come apart. This one is very similar to some of the benches that I've shown in the past. You've got a couple of feet, you got a leg that goes up. It'll usually spread out a little bit on the top, and sometimes there will be a board that is attached to the tabletop that will be then pegged into those legs. You've got a stringer going across. This one's nice. You can see that tabletop is a really thick slab tabletop with breadboard ends on it. So it really, it's a pretty beefy table. This is not what we're going for this time. Actually, what we are going for is really similar to these right here. If you've seen the picture, let's see. Here's another one. It shows kind of what it looks like inside. We're going to end up with a table. The legs are going to be actually 4 boards. A couple of different ways. So this right, oops, why is this going so far forward? Cooperate with me. Okay.
Gotta love technology, right?
Well, it obviously does not love me. So, see here real quick if I can get this thing. Okay. So this was the picture that was on the front of the class illustration. This is the Bruges Table, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation on that horribly. This is a 15th century style trestle table. It is in the Bruges Museum in Belgium. And it is where I'm taking the inspiration off for this particular class. It is not, we're not going to quite make this one. It's a bit sturdier and involves a bit more work that I really want to throw into a beginning project. The Bruges table is interesting for the fact that you can kind of see it from this picture here, but the legs actually all lean in. They lean from the front to the back. That is hanging. So the whole thing looks like it should fall over. I'm not entirely certain if that was intended originally or if it's something that is shifted over time. I am not I have not really checked these out in person. I'm relying on some other pictures. For anything, if you are ever interested in any kind of historical woodworking and you're thinking about doing it yourself, there's an under table view of this particular one. These came from the St. Thomas Guild, and they are a wonderful resource for anyone who is interested in woodworking and for reenactment purposes. They tend to do a lot of really good pictures and ideas from construction purposes, and they also give you line drawings when they do a lot of the recreation of them. So we're going to use some really similar elements to this one. The main difference is our top is going to be a little bit different to make it a little bit more friendly. So this is really similar to what we're going to be doing. There are other ways that you can modify it. We'll get back to that in a little bit. The plans for the bench that we're going to be working on, or for the table we're going to be working on, are going to be available in the link for this. And if any of the things that I've said, if I've gone a little too fast or they don't make a lot of sense, you can also, the class will be recorded and on YouTube on the Early Sweden site, usually within a week after the class is over with. And you can always get a hold of me if you have any particular questions to ask. So let's go ahead and get started in the actual project. So for this one, I had access to a number of rough sawn 4x4 by 8 to 10 foot chunks of lumber coming on dunnage. Every so often in my area, when the railroad come through with large amounts of rebar and such, they just have rough hardwood dunnage. And when I get it, it looks like this. It is rough. It is scaly. You can see there are saw marks on it. Sometimes there's good chunks in it. There's the occasional bit of rot or bug. You never know. But when I can get a 4x4 by 8-foot piece of hardwood for between $5 and $15, depending on who's selling it, it's usually worth investing in it to see if it's going to be any good, and hopefully I'll get something good from it. So looking at my dimensions, I went through and I went ahead and I started rough cutting some of these pieces down to size to get some usable stuff. And I ended up with a number of pieces about like so. When you're working with this kind of lumber, you do need to be really careful, especially when you're bringing it into your shop. And in this case, like I said, this has been out in the elements. It was never really treated. It has not been heat treated. There are cracks, there's things going through that. If you can see that, there's holes in it, usually indicating that there are little pinhole beetles, I believe it is, that are in it, or worms that can do nasty stuff to your wood. You're going to want to seal those. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Heat treating obviously works. It's good for, if you're buying kiln dried lumber, they'll automatically be cooked out of it. I've heard of some people that have had good luck with small pieces and microwaving it. There's various chemicals, there's various sealants that you can get. That's something, with any luck, you won't have to worry about. I tend to, when I get it, I cut into them and then I just tend to shellac the holy heck out of them, or polyurethane, plug it up, and then just keep an eye on it and hope for the best. I'm probably a lot lazier and lax in that than I should be. The other thing that I run into is, like I said, there's a good bit of cracks. You can see there's a good crack right here, and that's a pretty deep one. I can actually flex it with my hands. For this particular project, none of the cracks seems to be more than superficial. They are small enough that I'm pretty sure I can work around them, so I'm going to go ahead and just hope for the best with that, because I don't want to have to cut more lumber and use up more lumber. Ultimately, what we're looking to have is something like this. So we've got a top bar, which connects, come on, the back leg. The back leg is just a squared up piece of lumber, has a notch taken out of the front. The back leg has a slight angle taken off of it so that it's flat when it sits there. Top bar is 2x2 square, and I've got a vertical slot in it to notch into the front legs, and then I've got a notch cut in the back that is slanted to accept the back legs. Then I've got my front legs. So there is a difference in this one, the thickness of the wood. So these are actually at, I believe, 3 inches is what yeah. So my legs are actually 3 inches wide by 2 inches thick, which might be overkill. You can probably make them a bit thinner. I just wanted that particular look, and I had the lumber, so I went ahead and I did it that way. And then for these pieces in here, that is plain dimension or store-bought 1 by 1 or 1 by thickness. All of it is oak. Most of it is pretty straightforward. The place where we get into the tricky bit is these right here. So this is not 100% complete. What I've got is I've got a leg, much like my back leg, that is a 2 by 3 that has some blind mortises cut in it. Now we've talked about mortise and tenon before. So a mortise is basically lumber on the ground, a square hole cut in the wood, and the tenon is the tab that goes in it. A blind mortise is what we've got right here. It doesn't come out the other end. You've got also got through tenons, which is what we've been using for the most part up until now. Actually, we use a through tenon with a tusk, which is the peg that locks the whole thing together. So here's what we want. Here's what we got. So let's start the layout. Okay, so we're going to start with the back leg. Taking my back leg, these still need to be cleaned up. They're pretty rough from my saw still. You can see all of the burn marks from my blade, things like that. So I'm going to look at it. I'm going to decide what is my best side. And on this particular one, we had that section where it was a little wonky there. And I want that on the inside. I don't want it to be seen. So I'm going to come in here. And on my dimensions for my plans, this needs to be a total of 2'7" and 3/8 inches from one end to the other. And that is square. So in this case, this one is actually cut at 32 inches. It's just a little bit in excess, gives me a little bit of wiggle room. My angle on these is, I don't think I marked it. Well, that's not helpful. About 9 degrees, if I remember correctly. You can either do that if you've got a protractor or if you're comfortable, or you can go with a measurement on these. In this particular case, I'm going with a measurement. It's a little bit easier. So the difference for that angle from one side to the other is 5/16. So all I'm really going to do is I'm going to come over here. I'm going to mark from the end of my lumber. Hopefully you can see that little line right there. That's all I'm taking off. It's not a whole lot. However, the part to keep in mind here is you need to take that off both ends, and you need to make sure that you are taking the correct amount, or the correct side off. And what by that I mean is, this is my existing leg that I've already cut. It's a little hard to see at the bottom. You can kind of see the top, the angle is there. So you need to make sure that when you do this, that the bottom flat on the ground, the top is parallel to the ground. If you're not careful, what you can end up doing is turning this into a trapezoid where this side is angled this way, this side is angled that way, where instead you want both of them angled the same direction. So once I've got that, I've marked that off. Before I do anything else, I actually want to come in here and I want to mark where my where my notch is going to be for that back leg to go into. Sorry if I'm a little bit flummoxed. We've been out running around today, so I'm a little off my game, but we'll go for it. So I'm using a 2" by 2" square top bar here, and I'm going to take and I'm going to cut a dado in here so that when the back leg and the top bar go together, they lock together, they make a good solid piece in here. So it's not going anywhere. You can put a peg in here if you really want. You can have it going through so that when you put it together, the whole thing locks in place. I don't really find it necessary. Usually these are sturdy enough that when you put them together, they're not going anywhere, and they won't, short of being knocked over, they're pretty sturdy. You don't have to worry about it too much. The other nice thing you can do is, if you can see right here, is I'm actually just copying my lines. Once you get one built, it's a lot easier to use as a reference to do the other one. I'm lazy like that on occasion. So as I said, I've got a 2" wide top bar here, and I'm going to take about 1/4 inch off for this gap right here, giving me 1.5" center section here. The 3" bar, 3" for the back leg, I'm going to want to go in 3/4 inch on either side. So again, I'm going to go with my marking gauge. I'm going to set it up for 3/4 inch. And I'm going to just gently run it along the side, and I am going to score the section that I want cut. Probably can't see that because it's webcam, so I will come back here, and you can kind of see a little bit, marking it up with my pencil just to show what I'm doing on that one. From there, I'm going to come in there with my speed square. I'm going to reference off of that and draw it on the top, just so I have it as a reference. Then I will come in on the back, and I will do the same thing. Again, I've got a 2" thick top bar here. I'm not taking anything off of the thickness. I'm only taking it off the sides. So this line needs to go down 2 inches. Now we're going to ultimately take some off the top here. So I want to come 2 inches off this back line that shouldn't be going down, go down 2 inches. And this is how far the cut on that backside should go. It's going to be a slanted cut because this leg, again, we're at an angle here. So this slot needs to be parallel to the ground, parallel to these tops. So it's going to be slightly different cutting it this way than I am cutting it once I take that top part off. I prefer to cut it while it's still square, just for easier reference. The one thing you want to make sure, though, is as you're cutting, so I've got my lines here, I want to cut to this top line. I want to stop where this one does, so I'm not cutting too far down. That also helps if I'm on the right side. So I'm going to mark it again. So now you can see this first line here is what I'm going to shave off. This second line, this vertical line, is how far I'm going to go when I'm using a power tool to go through there, or if I'm going by hand. In this case, if I'm using a handsaw, I can chuck this in and mark off this angled line and cut it easily. However, using my bandsaw to cut it, which is what I usually do, I don't have that luxury. My bandsaw doesn't tilt that direction, it tilts to the side. So I'll cut in as far as I can on the top one, and then I'll come in with a chisel to take out the rest of it later on. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that really quick. Right with you. Okay. So I've gone ahead and cut, and I've stopped at my line. You see on the back side. So there's the difference between the two. That's what I'm going to have to chisel out. If you're doing this by hand, you can actually just tilt that in your vise and cut it with a handsaw, take that out without any problem. In this case, the bandsaw makes it a little quicker, but it actually makes a little bit more work, more steps for me in that case. So I'm going to go ahead and take this center section out here. Okay. So I've taken out most of it. You can see it's a pretty rough cut in there. It's a little harder to get. So I'm going to have to go through with my chisel. I'm going to have to take the rest of that out, but also I'm going to have to bring it down to that line. At this point, there's no real reason to leave this square, so I could go ahead and do all of that at the same time. I can go ahead and cut that section off and cut the bottom section off. That's just a matter of going through with my chisel and working from the line back. Apparently, as I was muted there, that means that my saw was not auto-muted like I thought it was before. So
That's very true.
but I think these actually get muted.
Yeah, they get muted.
You get the idea here. You can kind of see now I've started going through with my, this is actually a 1/2 inch chisel, and I'm just working my way down. And what I will do is I will start a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. I'll just nibble my way down until I'm getting it. And then I'll come to the other side and I'll go back and forth until ultimately what will happen is I'm angling it out so that I end up with a slightly peaked cut in the center. Once I've got that, then I can start working my way down because one side, this side is going to be higher. So once I've got them, so they're meeting at that peak in the center, then I can come back to this side and start working my way down because this side should be at my line. So that when I keep working my way from that center, a little bit, little bit, yeah, I'm leveling out the intervening area to make sure that it's a nice flat place to be. And then I can also take my top and my bottom off. That's really pretty much it. The back leg, once you get that notch done, it's just those two cuts. It's really a simple method of doing it. This is a
So
pretty,
somebody wanted to just verify. So leveling the internal area, basically,
yeah,
then.
exactly. Just making it a level seat. And again, making sure it's parallel to the top, which is also where if you've got good sharp chisels, you'll get a nice, smooth, even cut. Won't be much of a problem. You might need to file it a little bit, or you can sand it. If you don't have files or rasps, and to my understanding, the main difference between a rasp and a file usually is how coarse they get. Files tend to have parallel series and be somewhat of finer, whereas a rasp tends to have raised teeth and they are very aggressive. They'll bite a lot of material out. One thing you can do is you can just take some self-adhesive discs and a flat piece of wood and you can just stick them down there and you can use that to give you a nice flat area. You can get into a small area. You can also cut thinner strips to get into small areas that you might not be able to get a hand or power sander to or anything like that. So there's always a workaround. There are always multiple ways of doing things. It's just a matter of figuring out what you need to do and finding a way to make the tools that you've got do the job. One of the big things that a lot of people overlook in, especially in reenacting woodworking, is we're looking at things with a modern eye and a modern mindset of I can do everything. And a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do would have involved a couple of different crafts, or even if one project would only be a specific craft that would do it, it's entirely possible something like this would probably have been put out by a carpenter's guild. But your next project might be you decide to make yourself a cart, where yeah, the body might have been done by the cart, but the wheels would have been purchased from a Wainwright. I believe it's a Wainwright. Get the rights confused. But someone else would have made the wheels, and then you would have attached the thing. It's possible you would have made it together, but a lot of it was very specialized, and they interdiscipline cooperation to finish a particular project. The main point of that is the fact that there's a lot of specialized tools that you don't need at all for this series of projects, but you might need, it might be essential to have for that project. And it's more disciplined, so it takes us a little longer to get to that nice finished look that we're looking for. So we have a pretty good idea of where we're going. Ultimately, what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with a back leg that is, when you put it down on the table, will sit flat. The top of it is parallel to the ground, and that slot is parallel there. And then your top bar is going to sit in there, and it will sit nice and even. It's okay if you've got a little bit of play. You will have some seasonal movement with your lumber, especially if you're going for a good distance. You go to one climate to another, wood's going to contract, it's going to swell, it's going to expand, it's going to do all kinds of crazy stuff. So you don't want it so loose that it falls out, but a little bit of play so that you're not forcing it together or forcing it apart is not necessarily a bad thing. So our next step is going to be our top bar. And again, for our top bar, it's just a 2-inch square. And in my set of plans here that I'm looking at, we are looking at a 2'6" length for that top bar, which I've already cut this one exactly to length. You're not going to see this, so it really doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot what sides you use or what faces. This one's got some grain variation, a little bit of spalting, but it's going to be under the table. Nobody's going to see it. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to go 6 inches in from the end, according to my plans. Here is where I goofed. I wasn't paying quite enough attention when I did this. Without a measurement, you can probably tell that that is not 6 inches by any means, anybody's imagination. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this one. I do recommend a farther distance back so that you have some of this sticking out, just because this table leg, if I was going to go for a normal 36-inch table, now I'm going to have this great big trestle leg sticking just a couple of inches away from the edge of my tabletop, and it makes it a little harder to sit in it. If you're going to do this as a table that you're only sitting in from one side, or you're never going to sit in on that side at all, then by all means move it out farther to the end if you like, however you like the aesthetic of it, so that you can see that nice the joinery that you've done, or if you're doing any pierce work on it. But I had originally done it otherwise and messed up my thought on this one as to what I was doing. So I am going to stick with my lines that I've already got here. I can figure out where my pencil went. And I am going to go 2 inches back from the front, and it's going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. The reason it's 3/4 of an inch is because the 1-inch material from your local big box store, Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace, whatever, is usually around 3/4 of an inch thick. Again, all of your numbers from the dimensional lumber or any lumber you buy is going to be nominal. Take your tape measure and make sure. You never know, and it sucks if you're not thinking about it. You get in your head, hey, I just bought a 1x6x8, and you get home and you find that it's 3/4 by 5.5x8, and you got to readjust all your plans. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to mark the other side as well. So the both sides have now just got that notch on there. Now, in this particular case, I'm going exactly 3/8, so I want to make sure that I am cutting to the inside of that line. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself a couple of little arrows there, just to remind myself that when I cut this, I want to be to the inside and not the outside. The table saw width, the blade that I'm using here is about a 16th of an inch. So if I was to cut to the outside of this, my 3/4 is now going to have an additional 1/8 inch after two saw cuts, making it really wobbly. And that's more than I want to have in my play. So a couple of different ways that you can go ahead and do this. You can do it by hand with a saw. You're going to want to come down 1/8 of an inch.
Somebody just asked, do we know if 3/4 inch is close to actual size used in period
It
times?
depends on the tabletop, but usually no. If you're doing, depending on the tables that you're looking at, there are a few of them out there. Again, if you look at St. Thomas Guild, they got a couple of different nice ones. There are not a ton of trestle tables that have survived. A lot of it we're just kind of eyeballing as we go and hoping for the best. One of the pictures that I've got there, and here we go. We're gonna try this again and see if I can get it to work. Uh, so on the Bruges table, come on. You have to give it a second for it to come up. So the Bruges table, you can see here, that is by no means 3/4 of an inch. I would say that is possibly 3/8, maybe half inch, and it's just set in there. But this table was also put together a bit differently than what we're doing. You can see, dang it, computer's being snarky today. It's really, good grief. Somebody's gonna be laughing at this one,
It
not
just
me.
doesn't like that picture.
I'm guessing. Okay, there we go. So the one that we're doing, I've simplified it a bit so that here you can see the crossbar and the top piece are actually going into the legs and connecting, and then the legs are mortising and tenon to the actual crossbar instead of dropping down the way I'm doing it. That is a much more solid piece. It's not going to come across, but it also involves a little bit more complicated joinery that I'm just not looking at doing right now. This is intended as a beginning kind of class, and if you want to give that one a try, by all means, there are actually even line drawings to do that on the St. Thomas Guild site, but it's a bit more scope than I really want to get into right now. So I'm using 3/4 inch, the same reason I've used 3/4 inch pine boards in the past. It's because this is stuff that you can go to just about any of your big box stores and your home improvement centers. You can find materials and make them work. So I'm giving you an idea to go from there. You can cut these monsters down from a 4x4 of fir if you want to go that route. You can use pine, whatever you have your hands on. I had oak, so I'm doing oak because, well, I just needed to carry more weight to events apparently. Um, yeah, it's just the numbers that I have there. There is no hard fast rule. So once I've got that, I'm going to come in here. I am going to take out, I'm just going to bring it down 1/4 of an inch. That's all I need to do on here. It's just enough to make that gap right in there, just so that it sits in there. Again, you can do that a couple of different ways. You can run it on a table saw sled and take it with a dado stack to take out multiple at once. You can do it with a table saw, cut the ends, and then use a chisel to go down the middle of it. Go with the bandsaw and cut in deep, and then take out with the chisel. If you've got a router plane, if you really want to, you can go in there and do it with that. There's a lot of different ways you can take that material out. I think it's a pretty basic one. I'm not going to bother cutting that one there. It's pretty self-explanatory, I think. For the back side of this thing, for the back leg that we just cut, we're going to want to do pretty much the same thing, except it needs to be wider, obviously, because whereas for the front, we're going to come in here with that centerpiece, and it's just going to sit right in here. So it only needs to be 3/4 of an inch wide to hold it, and the 2-inch depth on here to reference that piece. This one's going to be a little bit more tricky because to do this back piece, we don't just have a straight cut. We're at an angle. So to do that, it's not just at 3 inches. It is technically, but we need to have cut it at that angle. So here is where your bevel gauge, if you have one, comes in really, really handy. And if you haven't gotten one, they're usually not that expensive. You can pick them up just any of the big box stores without much of a problem. So I'm just going to come in here and I am going to set my bevel gauge to mimic that angle that I've cut. And as long as you keep that same angle throughout your project, this angle should be the same on every part. That angle should be the same. That angle should be the same. That angle should be the same. This should be the same angle. So once you set the first one, if you make sure that all of your angles follow that, all of your stuff should go together pretty well. Now, since this is going to be slanted and we want it to lean in like so, your bevel is going to slant towards the back so that that leg sticks out. We don't want it to do that and makes more of a tripod kind of inverted tripod kind of arrangement just because it's not going to be as stable. Your base is a lot closer together. If that makes sense. So if you ever find that your table is doing that, you put the leg in upside down. So for here, I'm going to come in, I'm going to go 6 inches from the back, like I should have done for the front, but I didn't. But I did measure correctly on this one when I was going that way at least. So I'm going to come in 6 inches. Now there is my line going that way. Again, you see my arrow there. So now if I take my bevel gauge and I line it up, so again, like I said, my bevel is going backwards. That should tell you where that first line is going to be. I'll go ahead and I will come in and I will do it on the other side as well. So that now I've got, I got my mark, goes up, meets the top, comes over and meets the other side. Theoretically, you should have just that 2 inches in here. However, it's not quite. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to come to this top and we're actually going to measure off that top line again, 2 inches. So now that I've got my just marking in the middle, and I'm going to come back in, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Oops. Carefully not let it rock on you. So now I've got my 2 lines. What I'm going to do from there is I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to place this right on top of it. You should just barely be able to see your pencil on either side of your back leg. Instead of trying to figure out complicated math, going it's 2 inches, it's at an angle, I need to measure it, make sure it's exactly right, you can go dead reckoning. It's so much easier to do it. By using that bevel gauge, all of your angles should be the same. So the top of this is going to be at 2 inches. The bottom, it just follows down through. It makes it so much easier than trying to calculate stuff when you're not a math person, which I am not. Despite a background in making this stuff for quite a while, I tend to go for as easy as possible. So I've now got, there's my top coming off the sides, coming out the other side. And again, I'll do the exact same thing here that I did up front. I'm just going to go in, I'm going to cut it down 1/4 of an inch on either side, and then I am going to take out the waste in the center until I go from a square chunk of wood that looks like that to a square chunk of wood with a couple of notches taken out of it. It's a pretty basic step. It's not really all that complicated if you break it down bit by bit as you go. Now, however, is the complicated step. So we got a couple of things going on here. Originally, I had considered a couple of different ways of doing this to make it a little bit easier, and there are a couple of things that you can do. You can take, and if you're doing it as I'm doing here and laying out in my plans, you're going to end up cutting a couple of blind tenons in here. You're going to make square holes, which can be a bit tricky, can be a little bit challenging. You're going to need to use a chisel to do it, and you're going to need a couple different things there. I am really lucky. I have access to a hollow mortise chisel, which is a dedicated machine that cuts square holes. So it's a real no-brainer for me to do it. There's a couple of different ways to do it. However, if you don't have it, you can use a drill press and a Forstner bit, and you can go down to your depth and you can drill a series of holes, and then you can grab your chisel and you can take the waste out in between them, if that's the way you want to do it. If you don't have it, the real down and dirty expedient is much like we did with the 6-board box class. Instead of taking it out of the center here, you can actually cut into the front, cut in there, just like we did here. And instead of setting it in, you can set it into the face. So that instead of going in like that and being in the center, you would actually take a notch off of the corner and it would go in so that your face would be flush like that. I don't know if I'm explaining that really well. Hopefully you get an idea. Um, yeah, I don't use my mortiser very often, but when I do, it's a lovely, lovely thing. And they're anywhere from 250 to 3, sometimes a bit more. You can also pick up, for cheaper than that, you can pick up an attachment kit. You can put them onto a number of bandsaws that will take them. Um, so in this case, though, we're going to go more with what was the example. We're going to get as close to that as we can. So what I'm going to need to do is, first off, I am going to cut my mortises. It is always easier to cut my mortises first and then cut my tenons to fit, for me at least, because if you cut your tenons and then make your mortises too big, your tenons now rattle around loosely and you won't get a tight fit. Your tenons, however, you can cut them a little smaller, take a little bit more off, take a little bit more off until they fit snugly. So that's just kind of my preferred method. So to do that, my top and my bottom are both that 3/4 inch thick oak. They're both 4 inches tall. The bottom, I'll start with that one first, usually, for one really simple fact. If I screw up, I can always cut the top out of what's left over, and I'm not wasting quite so much wood. Whereas if I cut the bottom first and it's perfect, and I screw up, or excuse me, the top first and it's perfect, then I cut the bottom, now I've got this foot-long piece of wood that's garbage. So I try to minimize my waste as much as possible. So what we're looking at here is, you can see, I know my lighting is terrible for this, it is a trapezoid. It is 4 inches tall. This particular piece is 7 1/4 inches from the outside edge, in this case, where they're knocked off. So down here, if you can imagine where that point would have been, is where that 7 1/4 is. And then, apparently I forgot the top portion of it. I'm following that angle again. Again, that same angle is right in there. This one's off just a hair. I didn't cut it quite perfectly. But that right there will save you a ton of measurement. It takes the place of a measuring method known as a story stick, where you're basically taking a scrap piece of lumber and you are marking out where all your markings are. So I can tell you, okay, I want you to drill a hole at 3 inches, 4 1/4, 5 3/8, 7 and So then you got to measure it every single time. Or you can take a scrap piece of lumber, you can come up to this piece, you stick it on here, you draw a line across, mark, 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 mark. You grab the next piece, you put it up there, you line up your top one and mark it all the way across, and you just mark it so you don't have to remeasure every single time. It's a cheat, it's quick, it's lazy, but it's a good way to do it. So in this particular case, and I say this is a perfect example because when I did this originally, I cut my top and my bottom. Here was my original bottom. Here was my original top. Good to go. Awesome. I'm great with that. However, I didn't leave enough room for my tenons. Somewhere along the line, I missed up my measurements. So now that's useless. And that's useless. But I could have pulled that one out of there. I already had another piece cut, so it worked just fine for that one. So I've got a 4-inch wide piece here, 3/4 inch. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to mark this thing at 1 foot 2 5/16 inches. Now, this is something that I do to myself a lot, so I'm going to pass. When you are going with mixed measurements, in the sense that I have a 1 foot 2 inch, make sure that you are thinking about that as 1 foot 2 inches, also known as 14 inches. And don't look at that and go, oh, a 1 and a 2, and cut it at 12 5/16 instead of 14 5/16. I'm sure you can all imagine exactly why I can tell you that's a bad idea. So I'm at 14 5/16. I am going to come in here. I'm using my bevel gauge. I am marking off where my angles are going to go on here. So there's one line, there's the other. And if I grab this guy and I hold him up there, you can see, yep, there's my line in parallel. Just makes it so much easier to do that. So then I'll knock that one off. I'll knock that one off. Then I'm going to come back here and I'm going to take this down a bit. I don't need a full 3/4 inch tenon to go in. If you've got the bit, you want to do it, you can, that's fine. By using a slightly smaller tenon with these shoulders all around, it has one really, really nice advantage to you doing that. And that is that if your hole is a little bit raggedy, which mine often are, when I put it in there, these shoulders, this one's a little tight. My shoulders actually now cover the hole completely. So I only have to worry about this one set of lines being absolutely perfect all the way around. Whereas if I mortise the whole thing in, so this whole thing just slots right in there, then all 4 of those sides, I've got a little bit of waviness. It might have broken loose. It might be, it doesn't fit quite the same. The gap looks a little bit deeper. It's just a lot easier to conceal it when you're only working with that small amount. The other thing to keep in mind is the top bar and the bottom bar are going to be parallel to the ground. However, when this goes into the wood, they're not going in straight. It's going to be twisted. So that angle on the top of the tenon needs to be knocked down a little bit so that this will go in. Otherwise, what you'll end up with is, if this is going straight across, it wants to go in there and wants to push it down. So you either have to take out material out of the top, which is harder to get into, or just knock the tenon a little bit. The other thing is get these in there as tight as you can, make them as closely fitted, but we're also going to dowel this. So you've got a little bit of playroom with that as well to get it in there. How you choose to take these out is ultimately up to you. Like I said, there's a couple of different ways to do it. And It's really it's hard to explain without seeing what your particular setup is. You can do it all completely by hand with a chisel, which is another reason to do a half-inch slot instead of a bigger. A half-inch chisel is pretty common to have, and you can use it to take all that material out. If it gets a little wobbly, a little bit loose, you can cut your cheeks on here just a little bit fatter, or a little thinner actually, so that there's more meat in the center to fill it out a little bit better. You can put you want to have as much of this material in the hole as possible. You don't want to have a large glue void. When you do that, what you end up with is a pocket of glue that takes even longer to dry. It doesn't have that air exposure. It dries on the outside and then very slowly starts to draw towards the inside, but it makes for a fairly brittle bond. It doesn't hold as sturdy. The other thing to keep in mind is you don't want to do a face joint. So I've talked before about the structure of your wood being kind of like a group of straws. If you've got a group of straws, you've got all the material on the outside connected to all the material on all the other side. It's a fairly strong bundle, holds together really well. That's going with the grain of it. If we cut it here, what we end up with is all these hollow tubes. So instead of this flat face, if you look down at it microscopically, you're actually seeing all these little cell walls holding on to it. So the weakest ever glue joint that you're going to get is if you take the end joint and glue it to end joint, because you've only got little connections where it overlaps that will hold on to it. Sometimes if you've got a lot of it, it's not a super weak joint right off the bat. If you glue these two together, they'll probably hold together for a minute or two. But as soon as I'm not holding on to this one, the weight of it is likely to pull it apart. The second weakest glue joint that you can do is end grain to long grain. That is not going to hold very well. Originally, my intent was to glue it this way and then drill through the face to put the pegs in, and it just turned out to not be a good idea. So I went ahead and I abandoned that idea, and I went with doing the mortise and tenon with it as well. And then, like I said, this one is not completely together. I wanted to take it apart, show you what I was doing. When I finish it, I still need to do some sanding and some outside work on it. I'll put through dowels through the whole thing to lock it in place and keep it sturdy. So I've got this. I'm going to come in here now. I'm going to mark back 3/4 from my line. Grab my bevel gauge again. So now what I've got here is a couple of reference points for myself. These are things that I need to remember, and you can do them all at once or you can do them in sequence. So what I've got here is, if you're looking at my end, where these X's are, that's coming completely off. I want to take that off completely. I don't want to have it at all. What I've got marked here is where my next shoulder is going to be. And you're going to need to cut into there. You can do it with a handsaw. You can do it with a specialized plane like this one. You can do it with a table saw if you've got a miter gauge. You can do it with a bandsaw, but it's tricky to do, and I would really, unless you're really comfortable with your bandsaw, I would recommend against it. But you're just going to come in there and you're going to take a slight bit off. You're just going to score it on both sides, and then you're going to take that material off. When I did mine, I have a Tenon Cutting Jig for my bandsaw, or for my table saw, excuse me, which is this honking monster here, which is a lovely little thing, and it makes his job so much easier. It's not something that everyone has, and they're a little expensive to get. But basically what it means is I can run this through with a miter gauge, which if you have a table saw, you more than likely have a miter gauge. They usually do tend to come with them. So that's a miter gauge. It runs in the track on your table saw. So what you'll do, you will put it in there. There are incremental numbers here. You'll plug in whatever your particular angle is. In this case, like I said, mine was 9 degrees. So I will put that in the table saw, and I will run that. And when I run it and cut my edge off, this is now parallel to the blade. So I'll cut that angle. I will lower my blade down to come out at an 1/8 of an inch above the table, because ultimately I want to take a 1/4 inch off to make it 1/2 inch thick. and I will run it again. So that will now score that area. And then from there, I clamped it down to my workbench. I grabbed a chisel. I came in from the end, and I gently began paring off my area. Again, here is where a marking gauge comes in. You mark it with your 1/4 inch. That gives you a reference line to work from, so you know how far down to go. See if I can get this one to show up. End grain is difficult at the best of times. So if you can see that line, which I don't think you can. So that line right there. Once I've taken that down there, I'll know that that is my line that I'm going to go from. I am going to lock that down. I am going to come in here with my chisel and my hammer, and I'm just going to take a little bit off at a time, a little bit off at a time, until I'm fairly flat down there. Then I'll flip it over, and I will take it down, both sides. At that point, you should have already done the mortise to your leg, and then it's just a matter of taking your leg or your piece, fitting it in there until it fits. Again, you don't want to have to force it in there. If you've got to hammer it into place, it's too tight. Take a little bit more off. Grab a chisel, pare it a tad, grab a block with some sandpaper on it, smooth it down a little bit as you go. And you're just going to take off some of this as well. So when I did it, I came in and I figured I wanted a 3/4 inch depth. I took a 1/4 inch off the top, a 1/4 inch off the bottom to make sure that it fit in there just fine. It's nice and snug. It's not moving around too much. And then when I put it together, I'll glue inside there, but I'll also come in from the front. And I've got plenty of material here. So I can come in here with a 1/4 inch dowel, and I can put it center in that wood so that I've got enough meat over on the leg to hold it in place and keep it from blowing out. And it will go all the way through and make a nice sturdy joint that's not really going anywhere. If you're not really sure about it, make that tenon a little bit longer, move it out a bit more. With the amount of glue and the amount of material, the thickness in here, it's going to be a pretty solid joint. So I've got my bottom done, got my leg done. Now I need to do the top. I'm going to do pretty much the exact same thing with the top that I did with the rest of it. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to mark my width, which in this case is 7 1/4 inches across from the bottom. I'm going to grab my mortising or my bevel gauge. I am going to mark from my bottom corner up, since I've marked that one on both sides. I'm going to cut that out. The depth here is 2 inches. If you remember, it is equal to the thickness of my top bar. So that'll fit in there so that the top of this should be flush with the top of the top bar. And for my width, remember we took out a 1/4 inch on either side to leave this 1 1.5 inches wide. So my center needs to be 1.5. It's really, again, it's a matter of steps. It's how do you eat an elephant? This is a big project. If you break it down into little bits, I'll go in and just like I did with the top of the leg, I'll take my bandsaw, I'll cut down, I'll take out as much as I can, and then I'll go in from either side with a chisel until I make the middle part level. Then I'll come in here. Now this part I did not think through quite as well as I probably should have, because I did take out that wedge on the top, which I did not necessarily need to do. You can also see I went a little deep with my mortiser on this top one, deeper than I had intended to do. So that kind of, it'll be hidden, you won't see it, but it's not as sturdy as it could have been if I had made it a little closer to the bottom. So for that top part, you don't really need to take it out. It'll just leave a gap. Again, it's going to be under your table, so no one is really likely to notice it when you're looking at your table, unless somebody happens to take the tabletop off and say, "Ooh, I want to see the legs you got there." In which case, that's a pretty small error for anyone to be looking at. Now, I have mentioned that you don't want to be banging on these when you're putting them together with a hammer. There is a caveat to that, in that when this goes together, it'll go together and it'll stay together, and it'll be a done deal. there is a difference between a little gentle assist and beating on it. If you've got to pound on it with the hammer, then it is definitely too tight. Back off, take a little bit more out, and redo it. You can see here, just from the tightness, that's actually a fairly sturdy table there. It's not coming apart. It doesn't have to be pegged in place. It's pretty well good to go and be used. Obviously, you need two of them for your table. So, come on. So there's my tabletop. Helps if I pick the right back leg for it. Oop. Did I just turn off the mic? And I lost the other leg. Where did I do
No,
with it?
you're fine.
I put it underneath my tenon jig. So, if you follow the plans that I've got for this particular one, this will give you a top of the trestle at 30 inches, which is a pretty good height for most tables. Usually you're looking around 30 is pretty low for a table, but when you figure we're also going to put a top on here, it's going to bring it a little bit higher. 32 inches is pretty common if you measure your dining table at home. 32 inches, sometimes as high as 36 if you've got pretty tall chairs. It's a kind of a question of what's going to work for you and what chairs you've got and which you're building first, whether you need to scale this up or not. And if you need to raise this up, you've got a good, at the bottom here, there is 5 inches of height from the bottom of this bottom bar to the ground. So if you find that you have shorter chairs and this is too tall for what you need to do, then you can just come back in there with that lovely little bevel gauge and bring it up 2 inches on all of the legs and cut them flush and bring them down. If you know that your table height needs to be taller than that, you can add a couple of more inches onto there. It's pretty forgiving as long as you remember to keep the bevels at a parallel to each other and not make them into a trapezoid. I think that is pretty much it in a nutshell. If you have any questions, I know I went a little bit fast over some of that stuff.
What do you do as far as the tabletop goes?
Okay, so you've got a trestle. What do you need a tabletop for? There's a couple of different things that you can do for the top. Actually, I have seen a number of really ingenious ideas over the years. The simplest and laziest that you can possibly do is you can go to a restore or refurbished place, or you can go to Home Depot, Lowe's, Boat, whatever. You can buy a door. You can buy an uncut door and just flop it on top. It's nice and thick, so it looks beefy, but they're pretty lightweight. And you can just slap it down there. You can also do similar to the one that we looked at earlier on. You can get planks and glue them side to side and go in, do a breadboard end to keep them all sturdy. If you like, you can do battens on individual planks to keep them together and put that down on top. There's a bunch of different options that basically you just need a big flat surface. I have also gone the route of you can get some plywood. Go for I wouldn't go any thinner than 5/8 inch. At that size, it starts to get a little bit wobbly. Up to 3/4 of an inch if you want something nice and sturdy, and that'll definitely go with these legs. And then you get some thin offcuts of whatever. If you're getting oak ply, get oak offcuts. You can get birch, you can get maple, whatever goes on there. You can also buy edge banding pre-cut, pre-assembled that is iron-on, that you'll literally go in, you will hold it up there, you'll iron the thing down, and then when you're done, you're going to come through with either a router or a little trim plane, and you're going to cut it flush with the table. I usually use plywood and some 1/4 inch thick oak on with oak plywood, and then I will nail it in every so often with brads and glue it as well, and then stain the whole thing. That way, it doesn't chip up my plywood and make it look like plywood.
What size top can it hold?
Well, I would not go any smaller than this particular one with a 30-inch wide, because that's how thin the bar is. but or how long the bar is. If you need it smaller, you can make your bar shorter. If you need it wider, you can make it longer. I would say this one right here, I would be comfortable with a 36-inch wide table sitting on it, depending on what your tabletop is of. If I was doing a 3/4 inch thick slab of plywood with banding on it, I might go up to as much as a 48-inch, and have a good bit of overhang on there, but that would be really kind of pushing it. I'd like this a little bit more. I generally don't want much more than maybe 4 to 6 inches of overhang on it, but it's kind of a question of what are you comfortable with. This is not designed so that your tabletop is pegged or fastened in any way. If you're not comfortable with that, there's a couple of different things that you can do. You can take your tabletop and you can go from the bottom and you can glue a couple of pieces to the underside of your tabletop, which will come down and rest on either side of your top bar so that your tabletop is now sitting on here and is connected that way so it can't go anywhere. And you can do it all the way across so that it locks it in place. If you're really worried about it, you can drill holes in there so you can put pegs that go back and forth through it. Um, Sorry about that. Or you can just rely on weight. A lot of it is also going to depend on who you camp with. If you have a lot of rambunctious children running around, you might want to be a little bit more mechanically connected than if you've got a bunch of more serene adults. Um, Conversely, if your children don't run around a whole lot, but you have a whole lot of enthusiastic friends that might bump into your table and knock the thing loose in the middle of the night as they are enjoying their beverages, it's personal choice and packing. If you've just got a flat tabletop, it's going to pack a lot easier than if you've got pieces coming off of the bottom. It's a question of how you want to go with that. Like I said, this is a 15th century table. We hear a lot about trestles in tables going farther back. I know in, I want to say it's 11th century England, they're supposed to be pretty common. This is just one that I particularly happen to have. You can make simpler versions of it. If you really are feeling daunted by all of the different, cutting tenons, cutting dados, things like that, you literally can just grab your wood and you can come across here, you can slap it right on the face and put some dowels through it, glue it on, put some screws through it, and then put some pins or some plugs in over the screws to hide them. It'll make pretty sturdy. It's definitely a step up from a plastic folding table. And then as you get more comfortable, you can go from there. You might decide later on that, well, maybe I'll try that tenoning thing a little bit. And instead of that, you'll knock this piece loose and you'll come in and, like I said, you'll cut down the thickness and you'll just take a notch out of the top so that instead of sitting on the face of it, it's actually sitting flush with it. So it looks a little bit more medieval, looks a little bit more authentic. You can take it in stages, and this is some pretty stiff wood. It's going to last you quite a while no matter what you do. Put a good finish on it. Definitely make sure to seal your feet really well to prevent it picking up moisture and things from the ground. And this should be a project that you can use for years and years to come. Tabletop, however you want to do that, you can make it larger or smaller. If you like, you can have 2 or 3 different tabletops depending on if you're going to what event you're doing. And if it's just 2 of you, you're only going to need a 4-foot table. This will work just fine. There's 6 or 8 of you. Maybe you need an 8-foot table. Should still work just fine. You can make another leg and extend that out. You can have a 12-foot table with 3 trestles in there and be the envy of all around you, except when it comes to breakup and setup. But it's a pretty versatile piece to have. So hopefully that answers some questions and gives you guys an idea on things to try and make your camp look just that much better.
I think that is all the questions.
Alrighty. Well, again, you can find my blog at sawdustandshavings.home.blog. You will find the plans for this table and a link to this recording from early Sweden, which you found on Facebook, and that has got all of the other classes as well as a host of other classes on different topics that are available there. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to see what you guys are making. uh, please send it along. I love talking shop with people. So thanks for coming, and I hope you all have a nice night.